else coming in? So we have an interesting. We all have everything settled in.
You want to start? Go for it, yeah.
All right. So, out of that one, a slave owner to a northern free state and brought his slavery is not legal here. Basically, this went to the Supreme Court, and the ultimate decision was that Black people cannot be. Scott had no standing. The federal government had no right to limit slavery in the territories, the parts of the U.S. that weren't states yet. And this was pushed heavily by James Buchanan, the president-elect at the time. He wasn't even president yet. The ruling came out 2 days after his inauguration, and Chief Justice Taney. And basically, the president was working with Taney to try to convince a northern justice to side on to the Dred Scott decision, because there was a southern majority on the Supreme Court that were behind the Dred Scott. He was afraid it would look like, well, these southern members are ganging up on the northern members. He wanted to look like it would be a unified Supreme Court. So he put pressure on the northerners to back the ruling, and one ultimately did. And, obviously a horrible ruling, it's one of the worst rulings in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. And there is competition for that prize, but yes. Dred Scott is usually, they're a very common answer for the worst. And also, Buchanan was politically away forever. Now the Supreme Court said this, it's fine, everybody will be okay with it. The abolitionists say, well, the Supreme Court said it's okay. That made it kind of look like northern states' bans on slavery were pointless, because somebody from the South could just move there with their slave and people couldn't do anything about it. So, Buchanan was an idiot. And I can actually go over Buchanan in my parties and elections, my presidency in Congress class, so I'm sure you can have those kids over there all about it. I'm sure they remember everything.
Test tomorrow.
Again, I really question Danny's reasoning on that too. How does Congress going to have the ability to control territories? It doesn't make any sense to me.
There's some strong motivated reasoning on the part of people who were extremely pro-slavery.
So yeah, and then of course the Dred Scott, and that was just a long litany of.
I better not put that down.
Long litany prior to that, a lot of different compromises and adjustments in order to maintain this concept of American slavery throughout. You have the compromise in 1820, established the Nixon line. You have the compromise in 1850, but then that leads into the Kansas-Nebraska Act and bloody Kansas with abolitionists coming in and slaveholders coming in Kansas in order to compete for establishing the Kansas Constitution and whether it be a slave state or a free state, despite it being above the Mason-Dixon line that was established in 1820. And so you get all these different machinations in order to extend the institution of American slavery. And I always highlight American slavery because one of the things I talk about with my students is, because you always get these apologists like, well, there's been slavery since biblical times. And so, well, yeah, but American slavery was like a whole new level of slavery. Slavery before American slavery was, in regards to war or debt or things like that. And, you look at the Bible or you look at the Quran that tells you, you need to treat your slaves well, you need to free your slaves and things like that. And Americans did not do that. And so you have, chattel slavery where, these people are not people and they're property and things like that. And so, I always emphasize, American slavery when I'm talking about this institution because it's different throughout historical context of slavery. And then that regards to a different aspect.
Actually, speaking of that, you might know that George Washington famously freed his slaves in his will. Well, actually, they were going to be freed when his wife died, but then she realized she was living alone plantation of hundreds of people who would be freed when she was dead. So she decided to free them all immediately.
Smart move.
Yep. But Washington, when he did that, and that was 100% one of those legacy moves of, oh, he thinks it's going to reflect badly on him in the future that he is a slave owner, so he frees his slaves in his will. But public sentiment in the South became more pro-slavery in the ensuing decades, to the point where actually what Washington did would have been illegal a few decades later in Virginia. You wouldn't be allowed to free your slaves anywhere near the numbers that you did.
So the other concept that hits for, the other topic that hits for this question is Roosevelt's, FDR's Executive Order 9066, which authorized the U.S. War Department, which was actually the War Department then, and not the Department of Defense, to create areas of exclusion because of this wartime effort. Once again, the laws are silent in time of war. And so you can eventually get this roundup of Japanese and people of Japanese descent on the west coast of the United States and put into relocation camps, concentration camps. And so Fred Korematsu actually challenged this executive order, who was a second generation American. You know, he had no ties to spying for Japan and things like that. And of course, the Supreme Court like, nah, sorry, we got to protect, war interests, and you could be spying, so you got to go to camp, not the fun sleepaway camp. And so it should be noted that Justice Frankfurter on that decision told the justices the reason for deferring the executive branch for this war effort was somebody must run the war, and it's either Roosevelt or us, and we cannot do it. So once again, the Supreme Court kowtowing to the executive branch. And then the other one during the same war period is Ex parte Queer, where you had German saboteurs who were dropped off in Long Island, New York. And so one of the saboteurs ends up turning in his compatriots. And they get tried in a military tribunal despite civilian courts being in process at the time. And once again, this, many people will feel this runs afoul of the American justice system. And the Supreme Court rules in favor of the American government because these were acts of war and not civilian offensives. And so a tribunal was called for. When there wasn't really an act of war, they did nothing other than come ashore, they might have intentions to do it, but nothing actually happened that actually saboteured the war.
I feel like each one of those questions could take an hour.
I think we can take a whole class on each one of these questions.
But we do have one more question, and then we want a little time for Q&A. So the next question is, when have voting rights ever been so severely challenged? Who'd like to start?
I'll jump on this one. So when have voting rights ever been so severely challenged? And when we were communicating by email on how we would approach this question, I think my response was, Jim Crow would like it. So, we get post-Civil War, we get the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery, unless it's a form of punishment, you get the 14th Amendment, which leads to incorporation, and then you get the 15th Amendment, which protects voting rights for black males. White females still can't vote at this time period, and black females definitely can't vote. But you get this 15th Amendment protection, except you get. Sorry, I'm skipping over my notes and not remembering the chapter. So we have Reconstruction, which is basically a military tribunal, military occupation of the southern states from 1865 until the election of 1876. And the Rutherford v. Hayes is like, hey, if you all, because we get this contested election, and Hayes is like, hey, and this military occupation of your states, and the states are like, bet, we got you. And so then Hayes pulls out the troops of the southern states, and then the southern states are like, oh, you all gone? All right, we good. And start making new constitutions. And these constitutions circumvent the 15th Amendment by not directly banning African Americans voting, but allowing other things to go into place. And so you get things that we all pretty much know about. You get poll taxes, you get literacy tests, you get residency, record keeping requirements. basically affecting, excluding black males from voting. And of course, there's always loopholes, and so you get grandfather clauses for white population. So if your grandfather was able to vote, or your grandfather or a relative of yours was able to vote prior to 1866, you can vote. And so this really suppresses African American inclusion in the body politic. And to give you an example, in Louisiana by 1900, black voters were reduced to 5,320 on the rolls, although they comprise the majority of the state's population. By 1910, only 730 black people were registered, less than 0.5% of eligible black men. And so this is in stark contrast to the time period of actual Reconstruction, where you had, black voting at record numbers because they hadn't voted before. You had blacks being elected to offices in state and in some cases federal offices. And so once again, when you're able to be in the room where it happens, you're able to get things happening for you. And when things are, when you're banned from it, you have no opportunity to change that for the better.
Yeah, so worth pointing out because it was sort of a slow process in some southern states due to Reconstruction. In some states, that's like basically it. Black people can't vote anymore immediately after. In other states, it was a erosion of black voting rights over the next few decades. There were states like North Carolina, I mentioned earlier, the Fusion, Populists and Republicans, that was a biracial, mostly working class coalition. And in Virginia, the Readjuster Party, strange name for a party, that was also a sort of biracial coalition of working class whites and working class black people that took control of the state government. And this basically happened in the 1880s, the 1890s, and this led to a huge backlash from the Democratic Party elite in these states, which are, wealthy white elites in these states who thought, oh, well, we're just going to control everything since the Democrats are in charge. And the voters are now going elsewhere. So their response to this was to basically double down on white supremacy. Basically focus on racism as much as possible, because when you have this working class white-black coalition, that didn't necessarily mean all the racial tensions had gone away, just that they had a common problem to deal with to try to better their situation in the state. And when the Democratic elites basically go in and start bringing those tensions up, that just drives a wedge in these biracial coalitions, splits the working class white people and working class black people, that leads to the end of these coalitions. Democrats sweep into power in the 1880s and 1890s, and you have, we're saying, all these literacy tests that were biasedly done. You could give a black professor something and they could read it perfectly, and they're still going to go, you failed. And you could bring in somebody to spell white person can do the cat in the hat. Okay, they pass, right? Or they can't do the cat in the hat. They pass anyways. So,
I mean, when it's controlled, when the grading of these things are controlled by multiple people, then of course they're going to do what they want. So, and I get a joy out of doing one of these ability tests with my students in my class, and no one passes this thing. And there are convoluted instructions and things like that. But one of the things we talked about, of course, this divide, this racial divide and things like that, and then really, Lyndon Johnson, hit it, set the best, and he says, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. And that's really what, it comes down to, is you get, all throughout, American history, you get, this, leaders furthering their own cause by convincing causes along whatever line you want to put it on.
Yeah, and if you've probably heard of George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, the most famous segregationist. When he first ran for office in Alabama, he was, by the low standards of 1950 Alabama, relatively progressive, actually, on racial issues. In fact, the NAACP endorsed him because, as a judge, he was the only judge in the state who referred to black attorneys with Mr. in front of their name. But then,
I'll put them on that.
like I said, low standards. But I'm grading on a curve.
You hear that, guys? He grades on a curve. Use that in your class next time.
So, but he lost a Democratic primary, which was the only election that mattered in the South at this time, to somebody who was just willing to go around, just demagoguing on race all the time. And he decided, well, you know what? I'm not going to let that happen again. So he became a racist demagogue too. And he's pursuing his political self-interest, even though he probably didn't feel as strongly as he acted like he did.
Honestly, I really did not know about that. About the all stuff. That was interesting. Before we cut this off, George, real fast, I think we got to put in a plug for Puerto Rico and Guam. Obviously, U.S. territories that have no say in federal elections and also don't have a voting right in Congress. And so we want to talk about taxation without representing, I guess they don't pay federal taxes, but yeah, still, they get, laws applied to them that they don't get a vote on. And then, obviously Washington D.C. famously has their plates of taxation without representation, and because they don't have a voting right in Congress. And when I was a high school history teacher in D.C., that was on my students' mind. They understood that this was inherently unfair, that they are subject to congressional laws because under the Constitution, the DC is still controlled by Congress, but they don't get a say in it. So this voting is still a major issue.
And the only reason that Puerto Rico was given citizenship, which was in 1917, wasn't because we realized, oh, it's wrong to just own territory and have people who live there who aren't citizens. It's because if they were citizens, they would become eligible for the draft in World War I.
Questions?
Okay, thank you. I didn't want to cut you off.
That, I appreciate it.
You didn't want to.
What do you next?
I want to open it up to questions. Oh, we got lots of questions. That's wonderful. I saw him first, so why don't you go ahead?
Louder, please.
I'll readdress the question. I'll restate the question.
Separate but equal leading up to Brown, school education, and then after that, citizenship.
So, separate but equal, so the questions were, why is address separate but equal and then addressing citizen union. So, separate but equal obviously came out of the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson. Homer Plessy, who loved using this term in my class, was an octoroon, meaning he was 1/8 black, boarded a train car in Louisiana, and for all intents and purposes, Homer Plessy was white passing, but announced to the carriageman that I am a black man in a white car, and you should do something about this. And the interesting thing was, this was actually encouraged by the train companies because they don't want to spend money. Having to have separate train cars for accommodation means more money for them. And so this was actually Plessy was in cahoots with the train companies. Unfortunately, it doesn't go their way because you get this, the case being up to the Supreme Court in 1896 that Plessy v. Ferguson, and the Supreme Court saying, separate but equal doesn't negate the equal protection clause of the Constitution because it's equal. It's right there in the phrase. And so you get these, separate but equal facilities all the way up to Brown v. Ford in 1954. Okay, I want to say 56 for some reason. Brown v. Ford in 1954, because we knew that these things were inherently unequal. And then, one of the seminal things that contributed to the Brown v. Ford case was the Dahl test, where researchers from an institution, I can't remember what university it was running saying kids would come in and ask, what doll is the pretty doll, and they would point to the white doll, and what doll is the ugly doll, and they point to the black doll, and then of course, what doll looks like you. You gotta imagine the inherent disconnect that it has to feel for a black kid to say that's the ugly doll, and then say that doll looks like me. And the Supreme Court took this into account and said separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so while once again this is another instance where the Supreme Court makes a ruling, but then the president has to enforce it, and we know how that goes sometimes.
And actually, since we were talking about ignoring Supreme Court rulings earlier, Southern states dragged their feet for years on actually implementing Brown v. Board. My mother's from North Carolina. She was born in 1953, so she was a baby when Brown v. Board was ruled. She did not have a black classmate until she was in 8th grade because of how long they were dragging their feet or actually gerrymandering to create de facto black districts for schools, etc.
It's not just
It's still
doing that, as, you get white flight coming up to this time period, and then, you get segregation economies because you have, white towns saying, all right, we're just not gonna have a public school district. Can't have integration, it's not public, and running, private economies for all the students. And Brown, we talk about Brown v. Board, we don't mention the sequel, Brown v. Board 2 and Brown v. Board 3. The Supreme Court saying, you all need to hurry up. You all doing this wrong, get your crap together. And of course, it still doesn't happen.
Johnson had to bribe the troops.
Eisenhower, so John asked, was it Johnson brought the troops? You get Eisenhower bringing the troops in the Little Rock Nine. And so, quick thing on your Citizens United, obviously, this is the famous case that allowed unlimited dark money into it, into political elections because corporations are people. And so, really, if you wanted to counteract that, the thing is, corporations are people is an invention of the state. You know how we can stop that? States can say corporations aren't people. They have the power. They're a plenary government. They can do that.
Okay, Sam and then Terry. Okay, Sam first.
The present moment feels increasingly volatile. Can you discuss a parallel period in American history?
So the question was the present moment is particularly volatile, and maybe we discuss a comparative moment. I think it would be antebellum United States. I mean, you have this, like we talked about, this long march between this fight between abolition and slavery, and the United States becomes torn asunder because of this debate on whether blacks should have personhood. And so the thing I always found interesting is when I look at state standards, I'm supposed to see as a former K-12 teacher, I teach compromise. The Great Compromise that led to the Senate and House of Representatives, the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and then we decided to not to compromise anymore, and then a bunch of bad stuff happened. So, but in regards to volatility, the question of slavery and its expansion in the United States is really that volatile history component in our country.
The more positive, the more optimistic case, if you will put it that way, be more like the 1960s, rising political violence, corruption, and the like. So abuse of power. So that might be the more positive comparison, where there was another side, other than it was less drastic in the antebellum period. There is a difference there, which is actually you were nowhere near as polarized on parties in the 1960s as we are today. Look at the maps of elections of 1960, 1964, and 1968. There's actually very few states who, across those three elections, voted for the same party in all three. There was a lot of people jumping around, switching. We saw that with Watergate, just after the 60s, but still same basic era, where the Republican Party was willing to toss Nixon overboard when it was revealed how much he had abused his power. How corrupt he was, and we don't see something similar like that today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the nice thing is, on the positive nature of that is you get the civil rights movement, which for African Americans, but then that leads to other civil rights movements. You get the American Indian movement, you get Stonewall, and things like that. And so, these things do cascade, and once other people see it happening, they're like, oh, why not? Why not me? Why not us? And so that is a great moment of positivity.
Yeah. When politics are volatile is when things could go very good or very bad. But basically, whenever there's been an advance in people's rights in our history, it has never been in a period of normal calm politics.
Terry, come on. Speak loud.
Taken with your discussion of the State Department's and CIA's involvement in foreign policy post-World War II. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit by talking somewhat about the Dulles brothers.
So the question was about the State Department and the CIA being in cahoots with each other post World War II and talking about the Dulles brothers. And I don't know what aspect you want to talk about. Unfortunately, my knowledge off the top of my head is not completely great on the background of the Dulles brothers, so I can't really answer that question probably to your liking. It's just because I don't have information off the top of my head. I don't know if John has anything, but I will say like these gentlemen were in cahoots under the Eisenhower administration, basically wanting to put American influence across the world in order to fight the influence of communism.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And this was an era when the paranoia was so high, the slightest intimation of socialism, like I said in Nicaragua, like literally you are raising taxes on banana plantations and making them pay their workers more money, was taken as socialism. Now we need to overthrow that government.
Heaven forbid we have a village.
Yeah. I mean, hey, at least the price of bananas didn't go up 2 cents.
How much did it cost, John? $10?
But I do think it's worth pointing out here to talk about the United States as our self-perception. It's like we protected democracy in World War I, right? And by and large, we did in Europe, and we didn't show much concern for it elsewhere in the world in the aftermath of World War II or World War I, when Wilson was very interested in democracy, but basically didn't care about it if the country wasn't white.
Care about democracy for black people.
As I tell my students, Wilson's actually the only political science professor to ever become president.
Yeah, that's his name about it. Yeah.
He did, yes. And until recently, he had a lot of awards named after him. We finally changed that. As I point out in class sometimes, Wilson was so racist, he made other white people in 1910s America uncomfortable.
Well, you gotta show the what's the movie?
Birth of a Nation.
Thank you, Birth of a Nation. Viewing the Birth of a Nation at the White House. So let's just say how well that goes. We've got a question over here. Yeah, go for it.
I have been feeling my age, which is almost 80, and
Oh, I was gonna guess like 16, so we're good.
and I see a huge difference in history that you're telling us about, and the more recent phenomena of internet, social media, and so things. Will you comment on those differences?
So the question was asking about the history that she was taught, and the history that gets talked about in social media, and you got to take it with a grain of salt for one, because anyone can put anything on social media. Abraham Lincoln famously said that. So, and so the thing is though is that the ability to bring more voices to the room leads to more interest in being shared. I have great niche interest that you want to info dump on people. Now that I have a Twitter feed or a Reddit feed, I can info dump as much as I want. And sometimes that's really great because there's a lot of people who know a lot of stuff that I would have no clue about. And sometimes that's not great because there's a lot of people who post a lot of crap that isn't remotely true. So, but the really interesting thing with what we're looking at with historical studies is, for the longest time, like I said, we'll attack this with 2 prongs. One, you got to look at the layering of historical studies, and for the longest time, it's just your standard historical studies, and then you get more niche historical studies starting in the 1900s of looking at African American history, looking at this kind of history. And so you get experts into these niche fields of historical study, and then looking at history with different lenses, which is really important. But then what I always tell my students when I'm talking about social studies, because one of the classes I teach is social studies for educators, is for the longest time, American history was a mythos history. It was establishing our folklore, establishing that Washington and Adams and Jefferson and all them were great people. And I'm not saying they're not great people. They also did some kind of not cool things, and these are human beings who have complex histories. And so we can't put these people on a pedestal. Yes, we can examine them and understand them in the time period that they're in, but we can also understand the full picture of them. I think we got,
I think one more question, then we're done.
okay, I think we had the gentleman over here who had the same thing. I don't know, did you not?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, that was it. No, I didn't.
Last question.
A comment and then a question. Comment, and sort of in line with what you were just saying. I am grandson to someone who was involved in State Department activities and who welcomed the Dulles brothers into his home.
Okay, we'll talk. You should talk to Terry then.
And I just want to reflect a little bit on how the Republican Party, I think my grandfather would be turning over in his grave, because even though we may say negative things about the Dulles Party and about Rockefeller, I mean, Rockefeller Republicans built libraries in places like Scottsburg, Indiana, and all across.
Yeah.
And the Rockefeller Republicans were happy. Maybe they complained, but they paid 35% or higher tax rate, right? So that just political, that economic reality, I think, is important for us to remember. And
We can definitely talk about like the effective tax rate stuff. We don't have the time for that right now.
in terms of a historical analysis, I appreciate what you were saying about the distinction of American slavery, because there's very much a racial overlay in that. And I would even argue, having lived and worked in different parts of Africa, there's a particularly Anglophone overlay, because in African colonies, and even a Belgian colony where I live, there's 5 national languages. That would not happen in any Anglophone colony. And even here, right? We live close to a Quebecois, French-speaking province. And we're so monolingual here that we think anything English is, God's gift to humanity.
Yeah, I mean, we also go back with Bad Bunny. This is a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid someone speaks Spanish. Love that. I love that.
So-
Okay, that was fantastic.
Oh yeah, I heard there was a football game that Bad Bunny comes.
Really,
And I guess
advertising.
And I guess one of my questions in that is, as we look at other ways of being democracies that aren't just American, historically, are there any lessons to be learned from like
Yeah, don't lose American democracy.
French ways of doing democracy?
I don't do that one.
Heads will roll. So the thing is, like, you bring up American democracy. American democracy is a unique democracy in that we have the first past the post system, and president and things like that. Whereas you look at many other nations, we have parliamentary democracy, we have prime ministers, and things like that. And so American democracy, once again, is a unique democracy. And then when you look at the export of democracy across, very few of them end up using American democracy. I should be not talking about. At least get a couple there.
B plus.
What's the best?
In fact, I need plus 5 points, which I take from Oscar. Make sure but actually, parliamentary democracies tend to outlast that people twos than presidential democracies. So my old buddy I worked with out at Rice University is that British tend to be, and again, we're great on the curve here, stable after independence. Now, we want to set like Canada, the US, Australia, where you send your own people out to actually live there, versus resource colonies where you are only extracting resources like the Belgian Congo. The different situation. But former British resource colonies tend to be more successful than former French and Spanish resource colonies. And the reason for that just seems to be that the Spanish colonies copied the United States. The French colonies copied France. They wound up with presidential or semi-presidential systems. The former British colonies, they copied the British. And they wound up with parliamentary systems that are a little bit more robust for people's ability over the long term.
I never really thought about it.
I think we
US colonies and Britain and Africa. That's resource colonies.
I don't know about you guys, but I learned a lot
interesting. And it was a wonderful point to end on because I envy you guys that are in this. We have some wonderful resources here. That we have our next, because of time, the first Wednesday, board election that day. And I remind everybody when you take a little string in the box, you can see your name.